Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 203rd episode of the Bullvine Podcast. I'm Bella, joined as always by my co-host Douglas. Today, we're diving into a fascinating market disruption that's reshaping the dairy genetics industry. Traditional genetics companies are being blindsided, while dairy farmers and beef specialists are capturing a massive portion of the beef-on-dairy market.
That's right, Bella. We'll be unpacking how this seismic shift happened seemingly overnight, who the new players are, and what it means for dairy producers across North America. We'll look at the economic drivers, explain why traditional companies missed the boat, and provide some practical advice for producers navigating this new landscape.
I've heard that traditional genetics companies now control only about 25% of the beef-on-dairy market. That's a dramatic change from just a few years ago.
Absolutely. And we're going to explain exactly how that happened and who's winning in this new reality. So let's dive right in.
And Douglas, let's start with the basics. What exactly happened in the genetics marketplace that traditional companies didn't see coming?
Well, Bella, it's quite simple. While the main AI players were busy perfecting their dairy genetic evaluation systems and marketing high TPI bulls, they completely missed the explosion of beef-on-dairy breeding. They were so focused on dairy genetics that they never anticipated how quickly dairy farmers would shift to using beef semen.
But how quickly did this shift actually happen? Do we have any numbers on that?
According to peer-reviewed research published in January 2023, the contribution of dairy steers to the U.S. fed beef supply increased from 6.9% to 16.3% over just 2 decades. That's more than doubling their market presence.
That's a remarkable increase. What drove this change?
Several factors converged. First, we've seen declining beef cow numbers nationwide. Second, there's been increased use of sexed dairy semen, which allows dairy farmers to produce replacement heifers from only their best cows. And third, maybe most importantly, Holstein bull calves essentially became worthless around 2016. Major U.S. beef packers were actively rejecting Holstein-fed calves, leaving dairy farmers in a terrible position.
So, when dairy farmers couldn't sell their Holstein bull calves, they needed an alternative, and breeding to beef bulls provided a solution.
Exactly. It was simple economics. If you can't sell a Holstein bull calf for a profit, but you can sell a beef cross calf for significantly more, the decision makes itself. What started as a survival tactic quickly became standard practice.
It sounds like traditional genetics companies were caught completely flat-footed by this market transformation.
They absolutely were. They spent decades building elaborate genomic indexes and commanding premium prices for dairy genetics, while assuming their market dominance was untouchable. Meanwhile, innovative dairy producers and beef-focused companies were quietly building a parallel genetic supply chain.
Let's talk about these new players. Who exactly stepped in to fill this market need when traditional companies weren't paying attention?
There are really 2 major groups that captured this opportunity. First, we have specialized beef genetics providers who understood both the dairy production system and beef quality requirements. And second, perhaps more surprisingly, we have large dairy operations that started producing their own genetics in-house.
Can you give us some examples of these new providers?
One fascinating example is Grimius Cattle Company. They were primarily known as a cattle feeding operation handling dairy steers and heifers since the 1960s. But they've transformed themselves into a genetic powerhouse by aggressively acquiring premium Angus genetics.
How exactly did they do that?
Rather than trying to build a genomic program from scratch, Grimius purchased high-selling bulls from elite breeders, including Hoover Angus Farm, Spring Cove Ranch, and Gardner Angus Ranch. They went straight to proven genetics that deliver in the feedlot, something they understand better than most dairy-focused genetic companies ever could.
So they leveraged their practical experience in feeding beef dairy crosses to identify the genetics that would work best.
Precisely. But perhaps even more disruptive are the large dairy operations that have completely bypassed traditional genetics providers altogether.
How are they doing that?
Operations like Riverview and Feria have thousands of cows under management. At that scale, they've determined it's more economical to develop their own semen production facilities than to purchase from established companies. Feria now produces all its own beef semen, leveraging its massive scale to justify the investment in collection facilities and bull maintenance.
That's vertical integration in the dairy industry. What makes this approach so economically attractive?
The economics are actually quite simple and devastating for traditional providers. At sufficient scale, in-house production eliminates markup, allows customized genetic selection, and even creates potential for additional revenue by selling excess inventory to neighboring operations. It's a complete upheaval of the traditional business model.
Let's talk about the impact this market transformation has had on traditional genetics companies. How badly have they been hurt?
The financial consequences have been severe and are getting worse. As beef-on-dairy breeding has exploded, the market for conventional dairy semen has contracted significantly. Some estimates put the reduction at 25 to 35% virtually overnight, and this market contraction coincided with inflationary pressures that increased operational costs across the board.
So they're getting hit from both sides, selling less product while costs are rising.
Exactly. For companies structured around high-volume sales with substantial overhead, the math simply doesn't work anymore. Their entire business model was built around a specific blend of sales and volumes that the beef-on-dairy revolution has completely undermined.
What specific challenges do they face in competing in this new market?
Traditional genetics companies now face higher per-unit costs for dairy semen production because their fixed expenses, things like facilities, bull housing, genetic testing, and staff, must be spread across fewer units sold. Meanwhile, their beef programs lack the specialized expertise and market connections that give focused beef genetics providers their competitive edge. It's a classic disruption scenario.
So their cost structure doesn't work with lower volumes, and they don't have the specialized beef knowledge to quickly pivot.
That's exactly right. They were optimized for a market that has fundamentally changed.
Douglas, one thing I find fascinating is how differently dairy farmers and beef producers think about genetics. Can you explain that disconnect?
This is actually one of the most interesting aspects of this market transformation. Dairy producers have traditionally selected which cows to breed to beef based primarily on reproductive performance, lactation number, and milk production. Basically, which cows aren't worthy of producing replacement heifers.
And what criteria do dairy farmers use when selecting which beef bulls to use?
That's where it gets really interesting. For many dairy producers, the criteria are remarkably straightforward: cost, conception rate, calving ease, and solid black hair coat. This black calf syndrome, as some call it, represents both a market failure and an enormous opportunity.
So many dairy producers are just looking for any black calf without much concern for specific beef genetic traits.
That's right. Most aren't considering comprehensive genetic merit that would maximize value throughout the beef supply chain. Research shows that of the beef breeds used in dairy herds, Angus dominates at 89%, followed by Limousin at 12%, Charolais at 7%, and Simmental at 4%. This preference for black-hided calves is driven by U.S. beef production premiums for black coat-colored calves.
But there must be significant differences between dairy and beef cattle beyond just hair color, right?
Absolutely. Many dairy producers don't fully appreciate the significant differences between dairy and beef cattle carcasses. Scientific research shows that dairy steers have lesser dressing percentages and yield 2 to 12% less red meat compared to beef steers. This is due to a greater ratio of bone to muscle, internal fat, organ size, and gastrointestinal tract weight. Additionally, Holstein carcasses tend to be longer, while Jersey carcasses are typically lighter weight than carcasses from beef breeds.
I understand there have been some efforts in the industry to address these challenges with specialized genetic indexes. Could you explain these initiatives in more detail?
Absolutely. The beef industry recognized this opportunity and developed specific tools to help optimize beef on dairy breeding. The American Angus Association, for example, developed the Angus on Holstein Index, commonly written as $AXH, and the Angus on Jersey Index, written as $AXJ.
How exactly do these indexes work? Are they similar to the dairy indexes most of our listeners are familiar with?
In concept, yes. Just like how the dairy industry has net merit or TPI that combine multiple traits into a single economic value, these beef on dairy indexes combine traits that matter specifically for crossbred animals. The $AXH index emphasizes calving ease, which is less of an issue in Holstein crosses, but heavily weights marbling, muscle conformation, and appropriate carcass length to address the specific challenges of Holstein-influenced carcasses.
And what about the Holcim index you mentioned earlier?
The Holcim index is particularly interesting because it represents a formal collaboration between the Holstein Association USA and the American Cemental Association. It was specifically designed for selecting Cemental and Angus crossed bulls for use on Holstein females. What makes this unique is that it represents the dairy and beef industries actually working together to solve these challenges.
With these specialized tools available, why aren't more dairy producers using them?
That's the million-dollar question. Despite these resources being available, adoption has been limited. Part of the issue is that dairy people don't think like beef people, as the saying goes. Dairy producers are accustomed to selecting for milk production, components, and health traits. The concept of selecting for carcass traits, feed efficiency in the feedlot, and beef quality grade is simply outside their traditional area of focus.
Are there any success stories of dairy producers who have embraced these specialized indexes?
While individual success stories exist, the broader industry hasn't yet made this transition. The peer-reviewed research shows that of beef on dairy crosses reported by the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding from 2016 to 2019, 95% used Angus semen. But very few were using specialized beef on dairy indexes to select those Angus bulls. This represents a significant opportunity for education and improvement.
Let's dive deeper into the specific differences between dairy steers and beef steers. I know there's research on this topic that could help our listeners understand the economic implications better.
I'd be happy to walk through the research findings. Based on peer-reviewed research published in January 2023, there are 6 key characteristics where dairy steers differ from beef steers, and each represents an opportunity for improvement through optimized breeding.
What's the first characteristic?
First is dressing percentage. That's the ratio of carcass weight to live weight. Dairy steers have a lower dressing percentage than beef steers. However, with optimized beef by dairy breeding strategies, producers can achieve a 2 to 5% improvement in this metric.
And what about the actual meat yield?
That's the second key difference. Red meat yield from dairy steers is typically 2 to 12% less than from beef steers. This is considered the baseline in the industry. With proper beef on dairy crossbreeding, producers can see a 3 to 8% improvement in red meat yield. That's significant when you consider the economics of beef production.
What about carcass conformation issues?
The third and fourth characteristics relate to carcass dimensions. Holstein carcasses tend to be longer than standard beef carcasses, while Jersey carcasses are typically lighter weight. Both of these characteristics can be addressed with proper sire selection. This is where those specialized indexes we discussed can be particularly valuable.
Are there any areas where dairy animals have advantages over beef breeds?
Absolutely. The fifth characteristic is quality grade, where dairy steers often have more desirable scores on average compared to beef steers. And the sixth characteristic is performance predictability. Dairy animals show high uniformity compared to the more variable beef steers. Both of these advantages can be maintained with proper genetics while addressing the disadvantages.
So with a strategic breeding approach, dairy producers can maintain the quality advantages of dairy animals while improving the characteristics that typically make them less valuable for beef production.
That's exactly right. And that's why selecting bulls based solely on black hide color and calving ease leaves significant value on the table. There's potential for much greater economic returns with a more sophisticated approach.
Earlier, you mentioned 5 questions dairy farmers should ask when evaluating beef genetics providers. Let's explore these in more practical terms. How might a typical dairy producer actually use these questions?
Let's walk through each question with a real-world example. Imagine you're a 200-cow dairy operation looking to change your beef semen provider. When meeting with potential suppliers, the first question to ask is, beyond black hide and calving ease, what specific genetic traits does your program select for that will maximize my calf's value in the beef chain?
What should producers listen for in the response?
They should listen for specific traits like feed efficiency, ribeye area, marbling score, and red meat yield. A quality provider will talk about these traits in economic terms. For example, explaining that a 1 square inch increase in ribeye area might translate to $15 more value per calf. If they just talk about better beef qualities without specifics, that's a red flag.
What about the second question regarding feedlot performance?
When asking, what data can you provide on feedlot performance and carcass characteristics of your sire's progeny, producers should expect to see actual data sheets, not just marketing claims. A serious beef genetics provider should have information on average daily gain, feed conversion ratios, and USDA yield and quality grades from actual progeny. Ideally, they'd have comparison data showing how their genetics perform, specifically in beef on dairy crosses, rather than just purebred beef settings.
The third question was about specialized beef on dairy indexes. How should a farmer evaluate those answers?
When asking if they use specific beef on dairy indexes like $AXH or Halsim, listen for whether they understand the unique challenges of beef dairy crosses. A good answer would include an explanation of how these indexes weight different traits compared to standard beef indexes, and why that matters for dairy producers. If they dismiss these specialized indexes or seem unfamiliar with them, that suggests they haven't really focused on the specific needs of dairy clients.
The fourth question was about price premiums. What constitutes a good answer there?
For the question, what price premiums are your beef on dairy calves averaging compared to generic black calves? Producers should look for specific dollar amounts backed by auction data or contract prices. A quality provider might say something like, our beef on dairy calves consistently bring $25 to $40 more per hundredweight than standard black crosses at regional auctions. Vague answers suggest they don't track this critical economic information.
And finally, what about references from other dairy producers?
This might be the most important question. Can you provide references from dairy producers who've seen measurable economic benefits from using your genetics? A reputable provider should immediately offer contact information for existing clients with operations similar to yours. Follow up with these references and ask specific questions about calving ease, buyer feedback, and price differentials. Real experiences from other dairy farmers are invaluable in evaluating these claims.
So these questions help dairy producers cut through the marketing hype and determine which genetic providers are truly offering superior value.
Exactly. These 5 questions transform a dairy producer from a passive buyer to an informed consumer who can make breeding decisions based on economic outcomes rather than just tradition or convenience.
Let's look to the future. How do you see this genetics marketplace continuing to evolve?
We're witnessing a fundamental restructuring that traditional companies simply cannot ignore. Of the beef on dairy crosses reported from 2016 to 2019, a staggering 95% used Angus semen, demonstrating just how concentrated this market has become on one breed.
What do traditional genetics companies need to do to survive in this new reality?
They really have 2 options. Either dramatically downsize their operations to match the reduced dairy semen market, or develop specialized beef genetics divisions that can truly compete with focused providers. Major genetics companies have already begun moving in this direction by expanding their beef operations, but they're playing catch-up in a market where specialist providers have established significant advantages.
And what about dairy producers? Will we see more vertical integration?
Absolutely. Innovative dairy producers are likely to continue moving toward vertical integration of their genetic supply. The economics are simply too compelling to ignore. Why pay premium prices for genetics when you can produce custom-tailored semen in-house at a fraction of the cost? Of course, this only works for operations with sufficient scale.
What opportunities do you see for specialized beef genetics providers?
The opportunity is enormous. By focusing exclusively on the beef-on-dairy segment and developing products optimized for this specific market niche, they can deliver superior economic outcomes compared to generic black calf programs. The real innovation will come from providers who can bring dairy-style genomic evaluation to beef-on-dairy breeding decisions.
As this market transformation continues, who do you see as the clear winners and losers?
The winners are definitely the nimble, specialized beef genetics providers who understand both dairy production systems and beef quality requirements. We're also seeing large dairy operations with sufficient scale to justify in-house semen production coming out ahead. And the third group of winners are the innovative crossbreed specialists who can optimize for both dairy and beef traits.
And the losers?
Traditional genetics companies that fail to adapt quickly enough are the clear losers in this scenario. The market share they've already lost is likely gone forever. The only question is whether they can stabilize their position or continue losing ground.
Nufal, what does this transformation mean for the average dairy producer who might be listening to our podcast right now?
For dairy producers, this transformation creates both opportunities and challenges. The proliferation of genetic sources provides more options than ever before, but it also requires more sophisticated evaluation of potential partners. Those who approach beef-on-dairy breeding with the same analytical rigor they apply to their dairy breeding program will capture significantly more value than those settling for commodity black calves.
We've covered a lot of ground today. The beef-on-dairy revolution has permanently altered the genetics landscape. What was once a market dominated by a handful of large genetics companies has transformed into a diverse ecosystem where specialized providers and vertically integrated dairy operations play increasingly important roles.
That's right, Bella. The established genetic providers were caught flat-footed by this transformation. While they've begun adjusting their strategies, the question remains whether they can adapt quickly enough to recapture market share from the upstarts who recognized this opportunity first.
For our listeners, the message is clear. The genetic marketplace is more competitive and diverse than ever before. Whether you're running a large-scale operation, considering vertical integration, or a medium-sized farm evaluating breeding options, the days of simply defaulting to traditional genetics providers are over.
Absolutely. The genetics industry has been disrupted, and smart producers will leverage this disruption to capture more value from every breeding decision. I recommend all dairy producers take a fresh look at their beef-on-dairy strategy with the same attention they give their dairy genetics program. The economic benefits can be substantial.
That brings us to the end of today's episode of the Bullvine Podcast. We want to thank you for listening, and we'd love to hear about your experiences with beef-on-dairy breeding. You can reach us through our website at www.thebullvine.com or on all major social media platforms.
And don't forget to subscribe to the Bullvine Podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Until next time, I'm Douglas.
And I'm Bella. Thanks for listening.